Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Richardson. I'm the HAA Director for the Upper Midwest region of the United States, covering clubs Idaho, Iowa, Minnesota, Montana, uh, Nebraska, and North Dakota. I have with me our guest speaker, Professor Michael McElroy, who's going to give us a talk about climate-related public policy challenges for both developing and mature um, economies. Now, let's see now. I'm going to leave him to give you a detailed introduction, but he is in the School of Engineering and Applied Science and also Department of, oh, you better tell him yourself. I'm sorry.
Earth and Planetary Sciences.
There we go. And we welcome him to give us the talk. We'll have, after he's done, say 35 minutes or so. If you could, any questions you have, you could put in the chat and I'll do my best to feed them to Professor McElroy. I must say I'm at a disadvantage. I'm working from a laptop off-site because my home Wi-Fi decided to go out this today. But anyway, welcome to Professor McElroy.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to everybody who is online here. I thought that I would just spend a little bit of time. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I thought a little bit of time to sort of introduce this particular issue, which I think is incredibly important. I think that concern about what is going to happen to the future climate issue is a globally significant issue. And I'd like to sort of give you my 2 cents on why that is the case and why it is that we have to do something and how incredibly difficult it is to actually deal with the problem. I might also mention that Harvard has now a new institute for climate-related studies, the Salada Institute, that was funded with a very generous gift from some entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, of all places. And they have been having a meeting here this week, and I was at a meeting there yesterday, at which a number of people talked, including Harvard President Baca and John Kerry, who is the U.S. representative for climate-related issues internationally. Okay, so much of that. So a little bit of background to the climate issue. At a risk of saying things that everybody understands, let me just say that climate depends on, is fed by, the energy of the climate system is fed by energy from the sun. Most of the solar energy that arrives at the Earth arrives in the visible part of the spectrum, the part that you can see. And a fraction is reflected back to space by clouds and by bright surfaces, and a fraction is absorbed by the planet. The fraction that's absorbed by the planet, if it were not balanced by some release of energy back to space, would cause the Earth to boil over. And so what actually happens is that the Earth is able to reflect pretty much back to space, more or less the energy that it absorbs from the sun. And it does that by emitting radiation at longer wavelengths in the infrared region of the spectrum. So the sunlight comes in the visible, the infrared radiation is the return valve to space that occurs at longer wavelengths. Okay, so the Earth's atmosphere is composed primarily of oxygen and nitrogen, as we all know. Imagine that the only gases in the atmosphere were oxygen and nitrogen, then what would the climate look like? The answer is, without any equivocation, the climate of the Earth would be frozen over from equator to pole. We could not have life on the Earth if all we had in the atmosphere was oxygen and nitrogen. And the reason for that is that there are no absorbing infrared gases that are present if all you have is oxygen and nitrogen. one of the gases that plays a very important role in capturing infrared radiation or heat radiation from the Earth and trapping it is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has the ability to infrared with radiation, to capture infrared radiation and to distribute that radiation and eventually to distribute it and release it back to space. Okay, so we refer to gases such as carbon dioxide as greenhouse gases, like the glass on a greenhouse that keeps inside the greenhouse warm. Now, over the last 800,000 years, we actually know what the carbon dioxide concentration has done in the atmosphere, because we've been able to drill into ice in Antarctica and capturing the gases that were trapped in the ice for the last 800,000 years. So we know that over the last 800,000 years, carbon dioxide levels have bounced around between 190 parts per million, mostly during most of the time, up to 280 parts per million during a little bit of the time. And the Earth over the last 800,000 years has been mostly Ice Age Earth. And during the Ice Age conditions, the concentration of carbon dioxide was 190 parts per million. During the brief warm periods, it was 280 parts per million. So that's 800,000 years, up to 150 years ago. Up to 150 years ago, things changed. And they changed because we were beginning to learn how to use fossil fuels, coal, oil, and eventually natural gas as a way to run our industrial economies. And as we started drilling for coal and burning coal, mostly initially in England, to fuel the Industrial Revolution, we started adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, because when you burn coal or oil or natural gas, the energy that you extract is associated with release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Okay, so what has happened is that over the last 150 years, carbon dioxide levels have gone from a pre-industrial period of 280 parts per million to, where are they now? Over 400 parts per million. The last time we had over 400 parts per million is millions of years ago. We are now running a very different kind of world. And the way in which the carbon cycle works generally is that carbon is stored in fossil sources in the sediment. And then it returns naturally in volcanoes and hot springs to the atmosphere as part of the cycle of nutrients on the Earth. So what has happened now is that we society are functioning as global return valves for carbon 50 times higher than nature has done it. That's why the concentration is rising the way it is. So that's sort of the background to what we have to deal with. Okay, so then what are we going to do about it? Well, one of the things that has happened over the past, since the pre-industrial period, is that the global average temperature of the Earth has gone up. It's gone up right now, it's 1.1 degrees centigrade warmer than it was in the pre-industrial period. There's a real concern that if we get the global average surface temperature to get up to as little as 1.5 degrees, that's about only 0.4 degrees above where we are now, we're going to change the climate of the Earth in a serious way, and we're not going to be able to deal with it. Okay, so that's the challenge that we have to deal with. And let me sort of say a little bit about that. I don't think there's been a focus in the press and on television and in some of the media on focusing on the global average surface temperature. Global average surface temperature, as I said, is now 1.1 degrees above what it was in the pre-industrial period. And it's rising every year by a significant amount. And as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sort of argued, is that we need to keep it, if we can, to at least no more than 2 degrees, but preferably 1.5 degrees. How are we going to do that? Well, if we're going to do that, we have to do a drastic change to the way in which we use energy on a global basis. At the moment, the largest national emitter of CO2 is China. China supplanted the United States as #1 about 10 years ago. And China its economy is actually still fueled by coal. And coal is the worst in terms of CO2 emission. all of think of coal as almost pure carbon. When you turn the carbon into CO2, that's how you get the energy from the coal. Okay, and so China is the #1 emitter. The United States is #2. #3 is Europe, the European Union. #4 and growing rapidly is India. And way down the track are the sub-Saharan African countries that are responsible for no more than about 0.5 or 1% of the total emissions of CO2 that are happening globally over the course of the world. So how do we deal with that particular issue? Well, do we have choices? Well, let's suppose that we actually don't do something about it. What is the climate issue that we really should be concerned about? I don't think it's the global average temperature. I think it is really the problem of local manifestation of changes in climate. So, for example, in our country over the last number of years, we've seen incredible droughts in the western part of the country, supplanted more recently by heavy rainfall in the western part of the country. We've seen fires in the western part of the country. We've seen violent storms in the southern part of the country, tornadoes, hurricanes that are becoming more violent and are actually changing the climate in regions of the country that have not experienced changes before, including some of the regions in your part of the United States. Okay, so I'm more concerned about not about the global average surface temperature changes as I am about the changes in climate that are occurring regionally and locally, and how we can deal with those particular changes. All right, so what is the fundamental problem here? The fundamental problem is that as you warm the earth, you evaporate water from the ocean. That water vapor accumulates in the atmosphere, and it becomes a source of significant energy as the water vapor condenses to form rain. So what has been happening is that the Earth's warmer atmosphere of the Earth is holding more water vapor. As it holds more water vapor, it means that when the atmosphere is ready to sort of rain, it has more moisture to rain, and so we get excessive rainfall. But then conversely, somewhere else where the water vapor concentration is lower, and where the amount of water available for precipitation is lower, you have droughts. So the real problem is that we have a significant amount of rain excess and drought excess over the course of the planet. Add to that the fact that what is happening is that climate zones are changing. With the more warming of the Earth due to these increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases, the climate zones are changing. We have, for example, the tropical zone, which is called the Hadley circulation, is expanding. This zone is in fact associated with warming of the tropics and rising motion and rainfall, where you have rainforests, for example. Then that air moves to higher latitudes, and it's beginning to actually move further. And when it gets to the point where it has to descend to resupply the initial source, that's where you have deserts, because when the moisture deficient air starts to fall back to the surface, it has less moisture, it gets warmer, and that's where you have deserts. Think of where the Sahara Desert is, think of where the southwestern desert of the United States is. There's a real serious possibility that we're going to extend the range of this particular circulation. That means that deserts are going to move in the northern hemisphere to the north. What that means in the case of the European African context is that you're going to see the Sahara Desert moving into southern Europe. And that's got very serious, and it's actually beginning to happen, and with serious implications. And in the United States, you're beginning to see the possibility of the southwestern desert, think of Arizona, moving into the grain producing area in your jurisdiction. And that's a serious problem for people who live there. And so local changes in climate, I think, are a very serious issue. And that's where the real problem is going to take place. Also, I would say that in some parts of the world, the temperature is going to get very high. And that's already happening in places like India and in parts of Africa. and also actually in parts of Europe. If the temperature gets that high, a few degrees higher than it is at the moment, you're going to see a situation where, in fact, people are going to be seriously impeded in going outdoors into warmer temperatures that their bodies cannot survive. And that's going to have an effect on economies as well. I mean, if you're not able to work outside, then you're going to the labor opportunities for people is going to be diminished, and that's a particular problem. And I think that's happening already in parts of the world, including notably in parts of China and in parts of India, and increasingly in parts of the United States, where we're going to see higher temperatures than normal under high summer conditions. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if you're a relatively poor country, how do you prevent yourself from dying of heat stroke? Well, can you afford air conditioning? The answer for many people in the world is you can't afford air conditioning. And so they're simply going to try to sequester and stay indoors, and they work less, and the economies suffer. And so there's a series of problems that go with that I think we have to really begin to worry about. Okay, so having said that, and conscious about time here, let me just talk about individual challenges and countries. So as I said before, the largest emitter of CO2, carbon dioxide, from fossil fuel use currently is China. And the largest source of that carbon dioxide in China is coal. China burns coal to produce electricity. It burns coal to stay warm in winter in northern parts of China. Coal is a major input to the industrial economy. In the United States, coal was initially the major energy source, supplanted over time by oil, particularly in the transportation sector, gasoline, diesel, fuel, and also in industry. And more recently, we have turned down the production of electricity from burning coal and replacing burning coal with natural gas. We've done that not because of the environmental impacts, but really rather because the fact is that coal is a nasty thing to burn. It causes a lot of air pollution. It's got a big serious effect on public health. And natural gas has been relatively clean and relatively cheap compared to coal. And so the transition from coal-fired electricity to natural gas-fired electricity in the United States has largely been based on economic considerations. It's, over time, we had a number of problems with our dependence on oil. We had, dependence on foreign sources of oil that caused spikes in the oil price. And so we were worried about energy self-sufficiency. We essentially resolved that particular problem to some extent by introducing new sources of oil domestically, including using fracking as a way to produce both oil and natural gas, to the point where the United States is now largely energy independent in terms of fossil energy sources, with domestic sources of oil and domestic sources of natural gas. In fact, we are the cheapest source of natural gas in the world at the moment, and we could be a major exporter of natural gas to in particular to Europe, in response to the problems of European dependence on Russian sources of oil. Okay, so those are the problems. What do we do about it? Well, we do have other sources of energy. We have a source of energy from wind. We can produce electricity from wind. We can produce electricity from solar sources. PV panels are a good way to produce electricity from sunlight. And we also have significant sources of hydroelectricity in the United States, a little uncertain in the face of a changing climate, whether that hydro source is going to be available as it was in the past. And so we do have abundant replacement source of energy to get rid of coal, oil, and natural gas, to wind and solar in particular being particularly interesting possibilities. It's not completely simple. One of the things that is in fact relatively simple is that if you were wanting to build a power station today in the United States to generate electricity, a new power station to generate electricity, what would you do? The cheapest source of electricity that you could generate would be from wind. That'd be cheaper than natural gas and a lot cheaper than coal and a lot cheaper than oil. So economically, wind and solar are economically viable sources. They do have a problem. The problem is that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And so you do have the problem, how do you balance the supply and demand issue that is really, really important? Well, we have some creative ways of doing that. You can do it with batteries. I don't think that's the ultimate solution. Solution that we're actually particularly interested in here at Harvard is my group at Harvard is the possibility of using excess electricity when it's available to produce hydrogen by running the electricity through water, and you turn the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen, and you have what's called green hydrogen. And green hydrogen can be a way to store excess electricity when it's available and to use it when you need it. It also is a way to substitute the current sources of hydrogen that in the United States are largely produced from natural gas, and in China, the industrial sources of hydrogen are largely produced from coal, both of which are significant sources of carbon dioxide. So that's an interesting possibility. Having said all that, there are problems. So for example, the transportation sector is a major source of carbon dioxide in the United States. So burning oil in the form of gasoline and diesel is a major problem. So we have currently in our country an ambition to replace our cars, the internal combustion cars, with electric vehicles. And that means using electricity and batteries to run the cars. And that's currently underway to the point where, in fact, a number of important states, including California, for example, have made a decision to essentially ban production of internal combustion cars post, I think, 2035 was the target in California. A number of other states have followed that same route. So, okay, so electric vehicles as a substitute for gasoline-powered vehicles. If the electricity that runs the battery is produced from a zero carbon source like wind and solar, okay, we have made a big step towards reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide. But again, there are issues. I mean, the batteries that we use in our cars are lithium-ion batteries, and we are, for the most part, currently importing the lithium from outside. And there also are other chemicals that are required to run those batteries, like cobalt, for example, some of which is produced under awful conditions in the Congo, with child labor, doing really nasty things. And so we need to make sure that we're not making a transition from one bad situation to another that is not particularly positive either. I will also just also make the comment that in China, for example, China has very ambitious plans to decarbonize its economy, to go away from coal, oil, and natural gas, and to get to a zero carbon energy source, and to do it by 2060 at the latest. Our ambition in the United States is to do it by 2050 at the latest. Okay, so, but along the way, and China has more installed wind capacity than we have in the United States, believe it or not, right now. We produce more electricity from wind than they do, but they have more installed capacity. They also are sort of running the global market in terms of solar, in terms of their export of PV panels to the world, and they are doing that in a major way. But one of the problems that China had over the last year or so is that there were a number of times when China had brownouts, when the electricity did not meet demand. And so the Chinese government is now beginning to step back a little bit from its climate commitment and to say, okay, we need to actually still build some more coal-fired power plants so that we have a backup when we have a deficiency or shortfall in the availability of electricity, because our people really need it. And so to think about the Chinese situation compared to the US is that China obviously has a very strong central government. It's not particularly democratic society, but the government can do things that would be difficult for our central government to do with the kind of limitation of power that our government has. But the Chinese government is also at some level vulnerable to back pressure from their citizens. And last year, China had some shortfalls in electricity, and the public response was anger. And the response of the central government was to say, okay, sorry that we did this thing, but we'll build more coal-fired power plants, and we're not going to operate them all the time, but we'll have them available when we really need them. So that's sort of an Indian solution to that particular problem. Now, or China solution to a particular problem. So in the case of India, which is further behind the game in some respects, India has a lot of problems. India also is largely coal dependent for its energy source. It doesn't have a domestic source of natural gas or oil. And it has a situation that is in the rural, it's a democratic society in large measure. In poor rural areas of India, there's serious problems. Problems of unemployment, problems of energy deficiency, problems of unemployment in a major way, and leading to large numbers of suicides in India. India has a lot of social problems. And so when we think about our efforts to try to develop a plan for India, which we're doing here in our group at Harvard, again, we think wind and solar are really serious possibilities. We have to be sensitive to the social implications of how you do that change. Okay, I haven't talked very much about Africa, but Sub-Saharan Africa is an area where large numbers of people don't have access to electricity. It's a large number of people are poor, and yet currently they are responsible for something like 0.5% of 1% of 0.5% of the total global emissions of carbon dioxide. So they're not the source of the problem, but they are in fact suffering from what we're doing. And so the other large issue that I'd like to sort of close with is that we have this complicated situation where we have the rich countries that have gotten rich by using fossil fuel. And then we have the poor countries that have not gotten rich because they haven't been able to use fossil fuel. And then the question is, are the poor countries going to suffer more than the rich countries because of what the climate is going to do? And the answer is probably yes, because we have the economic facilities to be able to adjust to some of the climate implications that are going to happen, not to all, but to some. The poor countries, on the other hand, are just going to have to take it on the chin. So we need to think about a world in which the rich, responsible for the problem, have a responsibility to help the poor who are going to suffer for it. And so this is clearly a global issue and a really important issue for us to deal with. The other final comment I'm going to make is that I think that, in the best of all worlds, we would argue that the countries that got rich by burning fossil fuel and are now causing the world to have to suffer from the implications of that, they do have a financial responsibility. And can we get to the point where we're actually going to be able to indemnify, or at least help the poor countries respond to the problems that we are ultimately responsible for? That's a serious issue. And it's also a political issue, particularly a political issue in our country. I mean, we have this curious situation that the IRA, this massive piece of legislation that was promulgated over the last year or so in Washington to deal with some of the climate issues, including electric vehicles and roads and buildings and so on and so forth. That IRA was passed without a single Republican vote. Not a single Republican vote was registered in that particular legislation. So how do we get to the point where we in fact recognize that climate change is not a Republican or Democratic issue, but a global issue, and we have to get together and work it together? Let me sort of comment. Let me sort of close at that point and sort of say I'd be delighted to hear the views of people in the audience tonight. So thank you, Jane.
Well, thank you, Professor. as I mentioned, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. Maybe for starters, I've got a question. Here I am in Minnesota, and at least until recently, you didn't need air conditioning in your house. In fact, we still don't have.
Yeah.
But yet, all these people have been moving to Arizona and Florida and so on, and they need air conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, it will cool your house, the interior of your house, but as a net, it's taking the heat and putting it somewhere else. Is a net positive or net negative? Is air conditioning a net positive or negative to our existence?
I think in the long run, in some respects, it's a net negative because, you know, how do you fuel the air conditioning that you need? And the answer is that you have to use electricity for the most part to run the air conditioning system. I lived in Arizona for 6 years, 7 years back in the 60s, and you know, we needed air conditioning because summer temperatures getting up to 105, 110 degrees, you know, you really need to have some help. But you know, so we could afford to pay our electricity bills and to do that. But then think of doing that in a poor country like India, or a poor rural area in India. And if the temperatures in summer are getting up to 110, 115, 120 degrees, you know, how are you going to survive? I mean, at some level, you don't survive, you die of heat stroke. And in terms of Minnesota, okay, I think my guess is that Minnesota is going to have warmer summer temperatures in the future. Are you going to get to the point where the temperatures are so hot that you need air conditioning? Maybe not. But, you know, certainly the trend is in that direction. Of course, you could also argue that maybe the winter temperatures are going to be warmer, so you don't need as much heating in winter. That might be a good thing. I also spent a year in Wisconsin, so I know what it's like to be in winter in the Midwest.
Let me see. There's one of my friends, Chris Morris, says, "Thank you, Professor McElroy, for joining us tonight. I took your core curriculum class, atmosphere in 65 or 85 or 86. And even then you were talking about climate change and so on. Over the past 35 years, have you become more optimistic or pessimistic about the world's ability to change course and slow down the rising temperatures?"
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the comment on taking my course. I'm not sure how I would define my current situation, because I think I would have said a couple of years ago I was increasingly optimistic that we were going to be able to deal with these issues. But now when I sort of see the political tendencies in Washington, I'm very concerned about that. And I think that we really need to depoliticize the climate issue and to do something about it. And you know, on the optimistic level, the fact is that we've made enormous strides in developing wind resources and solar resources that are cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. So we do have the way to do things economically that are really important positives. Having said that, we do have a problem. The problem is that we have been building new natural gas-fired power plants because natural gas has been cheap in the United States. And if you build a natural gas-fired power plant with the economic assumption that you're going to have a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year lifetime for that system, then you know, if you're going to actually mothball and turn it off, there's a major potential economic penalty there. So we have a serious problem of how you make the transition from where we are now to where we need to be in the future. Even though I think that the idealized future is actually a very positive view of things, because you know, if we're going to have, if our primary energy source is going to be wind and solar and a little bit of hydro, and then I think that you know the air is going to be cleaner, and so health problems of air pollution are going to be diminished very significantly, and so that's a good thing. Also, frankly, if we can get to that idealized future situation, there will be good jobs for good people. I mean, we're going to need people to mount those solar panels on the roofs of houses. We're going to need people to build those wind turbines and to install the wind turbines. We're going to have people who need to be able to manage the power structure. We're going to have an infrastructure that's going to allow you to charge your car if it's an electric vehicle. And so I do believe that the employment opportunities are enormous as we look at that sort of future green world.
Thank you. I've got, this looks like two questions in one, but
yeah.
Professor McElroy, whoops, sliding out of the way. Please comment on the contribution of methane. I understand that methane is a more potent greenhouse gas being released from the oil and natural gas wells, in addition to cattle.
Thank you for raising that question. I should have mentioned the methane in my prepared remarks. Methane is the second largest source of climate change. Methane changes are the second largest source after carbon dioxide, responsible currently for maybe 50% of the climate forcing that is occurring globally. And the other part about this that I didn't mention is that half of the carbon dioxide that we've added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago is still in the atmosphere. And so the lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very long. And so even if you stop emitting carbon dioxide at the moment, it would still be there for a long period in the future. The beauty of methane is that the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere is about a little bit less than 10 years. So if you're able to cut down on the methane source, then you could have a fairly immediate, direct response, positive response on the climate issue. And that's a real challenge for us to try to do that. Now, what do we know about methane? Well, what we know about methane is that just like carbon dioxide, methane concentrations stayed relatively flat up to about 100 years ago. And methane concentrations have been rising rapidly ever since, just like carbon dioxide. What are the sources of methane? Well, there are a number of sources. First of all, the methane is produced by anaerobic bacteria. So it's there's a bacterial source of methane that's pretty important. And the bacterial source of methane involves cattle, ruminants, sheep, goats that eat grasses and have a second stomach that turns the material into a higher grade food. And the process produces methane that is belched out into the atmosphere. So that's one source. Another source, particularly probably important in India and in China, is that if you have rice cultivation in flooded rice fields where the sediment is organic rich, the methanobacteria are able to chew on that stuff and produce methane. But there's also a release of methane from coal-fired power plants. So if you produce, if you mine for coal, the coal mine also has some methane embedded with the coal. And if you turn off the coal, you're not going to mine the coal anymore. You have to release it. Some of that methane may leak into the atmosphere as it goes. And so, all coal mines can be a source of methane. Also, fracking has been the big change in our energy system over the last 10 years or so. And fracking is producing large amounts of natural gas, which is mostly methane. And some of that methane may be releasing or inadvertently to the atmosphere. We need to try to minimize that release. And also we have to worry about the leakage of natural gas pipelines that are leaking methane because our pipelines are getting pretty old these days. But methane is a very significant issue. And on the positive side, if we could find a way to reduce the release of methane due to anthropogenic, due to human activities, we could buy time to deal with the climate issue. It would be a really, really good thing to do.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, very good. Let's see now. My camera's going in and out. Let's see now. An interesting comment, not so much a question. I live in the mountains of Idaho. I've got some friend from Idaho. we had to put it in air conditioning, not because of the heat, but because of the smoke coming from the fires in Oregon and California.
Yeah.
Let's see, another well-wisher here who took your class in the 80s. I had a question. You didn't mention nuclear.
Yeah.
As a source of baseload electricity.
Yeah.
Do you have any opinions on that?
Yes, I do. I think that it's in large measure sort of an economic issue. I mean, you know, we developed our nuclear electricity system, you know, about 30 years ago, maybe more, 40 years ago, and now a lot of those nuclear plants are getting a little old, and they're fairly expensive to maintain. If you're going to build a new nuclear power plant using that old technology, it would be very expensive. And so the real challenge is to in fact explore the possibility of a new generation of small nuclear power plants, sort of which could make a big difference. And I think that we should be investing in what I call modular nuclear as a complement to wind and solar, because if you had modular nuclear, it would give you baseload electricity and on demand. And frankly, I'm distressed to see that countries that did have a significant investment in nuclear, notably Germany, is now essentially closing down its last nuclear power plant, even though, you know, Germany has a serious need for electricity and also has a serious commitment to climate issues. And you know, the issue with nuclear in Germany is in some sense political. Germany suffered from the release of the nuclear waste in Ukraine a number of years ago. That sort of spread that nuclear waste over a large part of Europe. Germans are very sensitive to that, and they're not particularly keen on nuclear. And when we had that accident in Japan a few years ago, that increased the concern that nuclear was dangerous. And you know, I think that the objections to nuclear are largely societal rather than technical. So I would think that I would say that Germany should not have closed down those nuclear power plants. If they were operational, they should have kept them going.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat? Looks like we were topped up here. Seeing none, I'd like to thank you, Professor McElroy. It was an enlightening talk. I have one last question.
Yeah.
Academics such as yourself, do you have the opportunity actually to consult or provide your technical insights to policymakers in the United States or elsewhere?
The answer is yes. So, for example, I had the opportunity a number of years ago in the Clinton-Gore administration to head up something which was called MEDIA, which was a group of scientists who were charged with getting high-level security clearances to advise the intelligence community in particular on issues involving environment and national security. And that was a very interesting experience. It was an idea that was fostered and developed by Al Gore, who I'm proud to say is still a friend of mine, and also was endorsed by the then head of the CIA as an important thing to do. Okay, so that MEDIA program that had, I think there were about 30 scientists appointed to that with high-level clearances, did a number of very interesting things. It was not just a matter of finding out ways in which you could educate the national security apparatus on the dangers of environmental change, but also there's a two-way thing, which is that maybe the environmental community could actually advise the national intelligence community in a way that would make a difference to their particular mandate. And I think we did that. And also, I'll just mention one thing that we accomplished that I think was really interesting, which was that one of the really sensitive places in the environment where climate change is really dramatically serious and rapidly growing is in the Arctic. So the Arctic Ocean is losing its ice cover. And it turned out that we have some ideas about why that is in terms of human-induced climate change. But one of the interesting ideas was that we didn't actually know very much about the Arctic Ocean in terms of its physics and its chemical behavior. And there were two countries that actually had most of the data on the Arctic Ocean. One was the United States, and the other was the then Soviet Union. And the reason they had that information was that both countries were patrolling under the ice with nuclear subs armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles in case things got hot. And of course, they were measuring all of the properties of the Arctic ice and the temperature of the water. But this was highly classified information. And Al Gore, when he was vice president, had a meeting every 6 months with his Russian counterpart, Viktor Chernomyrdin, in that particular role. And Al Gore, listening to our scientists, said, wouldn't it be a good idea if the United States Navy and the Russian Navy would agree to release that information to the scientific community? And our Navy in Washington said, oh, over our dead bodies, because this is highly classified information. We don't want people to know where we were at any particular time. And the Russians had exactly the same attitude. They said, we don't want to release this information. So we had this meeting between Gore and Chernomyrdin, and a number of us were there. And Al Gore was very good at sort of improvising. And at the end of the meeting, he turned to Chernomyrdin, with whom he had developed a good personal relationship. And he said, Victor, let me give you a little story about the Arctic Ocean. And he gave him the lecture about the Arctic Ocean. And he said, wouldn't it be a good idea, since your Navy and our Navy have all this information, that we sort of release the information to the scientific community so they can learn more about the Arctic Ocean? And Victor Chernomyrdin said, that sounds like a good idea, Al. Why don't we do it? And I was sort of looking around the room, and our admirals who happened to be there were going, oh, God. And the Russians were doing exactly the same thing. And so he turned over the job of trying to do this thing to us. And we came up with a very simple solution, which was that, okay, we don't need to know exactly when the measurement was made, the exact time, the exact place. Why don't we just average the information over a monthly period, and we'll still learn a lot. And so we actually did that, and we released this information to the scientific community globally, and it's been very, very useful. Yes.
That's a fascinating story. Thank you. I think we are pretty much had our questions answered. I certainly appreciate your time, Professor McElroy, and I thank everyone who joined us.
It's my pleasure.
And we'll be making this available on our YouTube channel in the future for people who couldn't make it. But in the meantime, everybody have a wonderful evening, and enjoy the new spring, which has finally arrived in Minnesota.
And here also.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you much,
Thank
Jim,
you.
for organizing
Bye.
it. Thank you. Bye.